So let's talk about fly rods. In my opinion, the optimal rod is the 7-weight for carp. I will tell you that more carp fishermen that I know fish with a 6 than a 7-weight. And then I do have quite a few buddies that fish 8-weights. So you can go with any one of those and that will work. So I want to talk plus and minuses of each of those a little bit. But the reason we choose rod weights for specific fish, the number one reason is presentation. It's what we're casting and how we want it to land. That's why you choose a 7, 8, 9 weight for a bass rig and a 3, 4, 5 weight for a trout rig. It's about a delicate landing fly with trout versus hammering a fly down on a bass to try to get their attention. That's why we choose them. The secondary reason is backbone, being able to lift the fish, lifting power. Okay, for carp, a lot of times we do cast very delicate flies, and we want them to land delicately. So like a traditional bass rod, sometimes you got to be careful or you're going to hammer that in and you're just going to scare the fish. I mean, they're designed to drive a fly down. That's not what we want with carp. We want it to be more like bone fishing. I always compare it to bone fishing because the way you want the fly to land is very similar to bone fishing. You want it to land as softly as possible. We'll get into more of that in a little bit, but just so you understand, that's why a lot of guys go with 6 weights, because it is easier to drop a fly in delicately, casting delicate flies with a 6 weight than it is with a 7 or an 8 weight. Almost every one of my buddies that fishes 6 weights breaks them fairly regularly. It is just not enough backbone if you hook a good carp. It's very difficult to finish getting a carp to the net on a 6 weight. Even my 7 weight I sometimes struggle with, but to me that's the best balance, and that's why I use a 7 weight. It also depends on the size of the fish that you are targeting. We have a lot of carp in Utah in the 5 to 7 pound range. I mean, that's probably the most common that you're going to catch when you go out and you catch carp. And a 5 to 7 pound carp still fights very hard. You're going to love having that on the end of your line. All right, so reels. For a lot of traditional fly fishing, bass, trout, your reel's not all that important. You don't use the drag that much. I mean, a lot of times people strip, even if they put it on the reel, 95% of the time, you're barely even using your drag. You're going to use your drag with carp. You're going to use your drag. So you want at least a decent reel for carp fly fishing. You don't want to try to palm these things. They'll tear your hands apart when they're screaming line out. And they will rip it out fast. So definitely don't recommend trying to palm the drag on carp. Yeah, I've seen a guy destroy his hand trying to palm them. Don't get a decent drag. The reel that I like for carp that's pretty reasonably priced is like the Redington Behemoth. That's a pretty good, it's got a great drag system and it doesn't bust the bank. So that's a reel I do like to use for carp. Okay, so line. There are situations where you could use sinking line, but realistically, carp fly fishing, you're looking for shallow water. You want your line above the carp. You really want floating line. And when we get into the techniques of how we actually target carp, it'll make more sense why that's important. There are very specific situations. I'm not even going to go in today because it's so rare that it's not worth it to try to worry about it. Let's focus on the successful ways to target carp. Floating line matched with your reel, or matched with your rod, not your reel. As far as taper goes, a longer taper is a little bit better than a short taper. You don't want something, again, that's driving a fly hard into the water like a shorter taper will do. A longer tapered line is going to land that fly a little bit more delicately. Having said that, just about any weight forward floating line will work. Color-wise, and we'll get into why this is important a little bit later too, but my favorite is light blue. I can never find it anymore. Cortland used to make a light blue, just weight forward, that I have a whole bunch of. I can't find it. And what I have, I bought 6 of them last time I saw it. Yeah. So if you can find light blue, that's the best, in my opinion, but it's, I never see it anymore. I still have a couple left. If you can't find light blue, gray, white, moss, you know, those typical more stealthy colors, you want to stick with that. Stay away from any of the bright colors. So leader and tippet. I typically run between 12 and 18 feet for my So I'll explain why that's important too as we get into it a little bit later, but I don't ever like to go less than 12 feet. I will sometimes, if it's really windy, drop down to 10, but that would be like the absolute shortest I would ever go. And again, when we get into technique, I'll explain why that's important. Terminal tippet, I use 8 to 12 pound. 10, I would say I use the majority of the time. Occasionally, if I know I'm in an area where they're going to go get into stuff and wrap, and I really need to put pressure on the fish, I'll up it if I know I'm in that situation. I've caught them on as big as 20-pound fluoro. Yeah, but 10 is usually what I use in more places. Even in the crystal clear water that I fish, I still use 10-pound fluoro. And then I have kind of a... Is your entire leader fluoro or just the last? So the most important part is the terminal tippet, right? I build my own a lot of times, and I use fluoro for the whole thing. I like fluoro. The only thing about fluoro is the knots don't stay together very well. So usually I'll build a leader and then I'll put a little UV resin on the knots just to make sure they don't come apart. And then this formula here, build your own, that's just Lefty Kray's formula. The only difference is I usually go pretty long on the last section. I don't want to knot anywhere close to that carp where it can see it and I can spook it. And we'll get into why they see that much better than other sport fish when we talk a little bit more about that. But does that make sense for... Now you can use mono. I'm not saying you can't. I've caught them with mono. But I still, even if you do like a mono tapered leader, I would use your fluoro for your tippet. Fluoro is just, it's less visible and it's more abrasion resistant and stronger per diameter. So it's also more expensive. So I get... Essentially what we're doing, and this is why when I talked about how long my leader is, this is where this becomes important. I want to cast basically half the distance of my leader past the carp so that my fly lands 4, 5, 6, 8, 9 feet away from the carp when it hits the water. Because that lateral line is so sensitive, the closer that fly lands to the carp, the more chance I'm going to spook it, just with that fly landing in that area. And that's usually where we spook fish. That fly lands, it's too close, and it scares them. Especially if we're casting a heavier fly, a dumbbell eye, which is what most people use over like a bead chain or a faux pearl. You cast a dumbbell within 5 or 6 feet on the surface of a carp, typically you're going to spook the carp. So the longer that leader is, the better. Now the next thing that scares them is my fly line when it lands. So if I have an 18-foot leader, all of a sudden I've got a much bigger range that I can put that fly and fly line and not scare the fish, right? Because I got to land it on each side of the fish for drag and drop.